We interrupt your broadcast to bring you an episode from the Stephen or Else network of truly epic podcasts. Find more shows at stephenorelse.com.
It's minuscule, it's mired in minutia. It's a microcosm of madcap malignity. Madman's snappy world suddenly becomes big when the bodacious hero is shrunk by a bizarre blend of unknown chemicals. On his journey back to Buzztown, desperate for aid from Dr. Flem, the shrinky-dink madman encounters the creep and the mysterious yellow-eyed creature from beneath the stairs. That's today on Just Another Fanboy. Hello and welcome to Just Another Fanboy, the podcast that says stuff like this. I'm your host, my name is Steven, and I warned you folks, I said it back in episode 304 that I was going to start giving you a great big bunch of Madman episodes right in a row, and here we are with another Madman episode. Granted, it's only the second one in a row at this point, but yeah, I warned you. So today we're going to look at Madman Comics number 9. This issue is published by Dark Horse on October 19th, 1995. It had a cover price of $2.95, and it is titled Little Lexicon of Life, or The Tale of the Mini Madman. It was written by Mike Allred, with art by Mike Allred, letters by Sean Cannot, and the colorist was Laura Allred. Now, normally what I've been doing at this point is I would read you the issues blurb from over there on darkhorse.com, but I already did that. That was what you heard there in the cold opening of the show. So let's just get into the book. Are you ready? Let's begin. I'm going to start with the cover. The cover features what appears to be a giant zombie-looking guy with a t-shirt on that says Creep. And he is about to step on our hero, Frank Einstein, the madman of Snap City. Of course, this zombie-looking dude is not a giant because Mr. Allred has made sure to show us a men's room door that the creep, as we're going to call him, that the creep is walking through. There's also a toothbrush there next to Frank. And Frank's about the size of the toothbrush. There's also a little robot there with him, and it looks like one of those toy robots from the 70s. Matter of fact, I looked it up, and I don't know if there is a particular name for this particular type of robot, but the image I found of toy robots that comes the closest to this particular one, I got this off of the, it's collection.sciencemuseumgroup.org.uk. And apparently they've got a collection of toy robots here. And so the one I found is called a Super Robot. It's from 1977 and it was made in Japan. And it most closely resembles the little robot that we're seeing on the cover. So as the story opens, if you remember from last week in the previous issue, after Frank had fought the puke monster, he had been running down into the basement, into the bowels of the hospital, and the puke monster was chasing him, and he was tossing all kinds of stuff at it. He had originally been shooting at it with Alka-Seltzer tablets. He doused it with some borax. He threw packing peanuts on it, and then he found like a tank hanging on a wall that had some experimental chemical in it, and he doused both himself and the puke monster with that chemical. And so the puke monster shrunk down to about the size of something that would fit in maybe a gallon or 2-gallon jug of milk. And do they make 2-gallon jugs of milk? I don't think so. But Frank had a big glass bottle there, and he managed to get the tiny puke monster into the bottle. And the reason he was running for the basement was because there is a Moto Rooter car system that he and Dr. Flem had built, various tunnels and these Moto Rooter cars that connected or that sped through these tunnels so that Dr. Flem's home in Buzztown was connected to Dr. Boyford or Professor Boyford's home in Snap City. And they opened up in various places so that ultimately Dr. Flem could go back and forth between Buzztown and Snap City very, very quickly. And Frank had to get back to Dr. Flem and, more importantly, to Joe, the love of his life, and his buddy Mott from the planet Hoople. And so he gathered up the tiny puke monster, put it in a bottle, corked the bottle, jumped in one of these Moto Rooter cars, and they rocketed away. And that's where we kind of open up. Oh, I should also mention that when Frank and the puke monster were doused with this experimental chemical, he wasn't wearing his normal costume at the time. He was wearing like a scuba suit, but his costume was there in the basement and it got soaked by the chemicals as well. And he tried to wring it out as well as he could, but he went ahead and put that wet costume on. And again, they rocketed off. So as we open up this issue, they're zooming along this Moto Rooter track when suddenly Frank starts to shrink. And he gets small enough that he's almost smaller than the puke monster. And he gets down, he immediately just shrinks down to this tiny size. And he realizes that the Moto Rooter car is heading for a dead end. And there is a point as they're zooming along that he is supposed to hit this button to switch the track to move the car from the track that's heading for the dead end and move it to the main track that will take them into Buzztown. Now, God forbid that I say anything negative about Mike Allred in his writing, but I did find that this is probably the first time in we're up to 15. This is the 15th issue of Madman of some sort that we have looked at. And this is the first time I've ever went, I don't know about that, Mike. And really what I'm trying to point out here is that why would this Moto Rooter car that's heading from Snap City to Buzztown, why would it default to run along a track that goes to a dead end? Why would he need to manually switch the track to the Buzztown track? That didn't make any sense to me, but it needed to happen so that the Moto Rooter car could crash because he's not able to press the button. He's too small. He can't get the button pressed in the size that he's at. And so the car crashes into the dead end and causes a cave in. And Frank is knocked unconscious. And he has this dream that he's standing on a mountaintop, and above him, he meets he looks like a young Clint Eastwood. And the young Clint Eastwood tells Frank that I am Nephite, one of the three. You are one of the four. Now, Frank has met the other two Nephites before. And, it's funny. When I just read this book back in the 90s, when I was just reading this book, I didn't really look too deeply into any of that stuff. The Nephite, basically. Just thought it was something that Allred had created, some mystical being that came out of his imagination. And turns out, no, that's not the case. Of course, I looked this up when the first Nephite appeared because, I was going to talk about it on a podcast. So I wanted to make sure I had all my ducks in a row because I'm not a smart man and I like to have the information in front of me. Now, unfortunately, what happens is because I don't like to research too much, I don't always get all of the information in front of me, but I did look this up and it turns out that this is something that comes out of the Mormon faith. Allred, as I said, is a Mormon. And I do have to say here that as I was researching what a Nephite is, I'm still not quite sure. It's some kind of possibly mystical beings that are descendant of people that came over to the New Americas a long, long time ago. And I don't know. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. But the more I read into it, the more I would find articles in various Mormon papers, magazines, websites, and whatnot that were talking about Mike Allred and how he is injecting a lot of his Mormon philosophies or whatnot, his beliefs into this book, and that the character of Frank Einstein is like a Mormon superhero and all this junk. And while that may be true, I don't know. I mean, yeah, Allred's a Mormon. I don't know much about the Mormon faith. I talked about that last week. I've never really felt like doing a lot of research, simply because A, I don't like to do research, and B, myself, I'm not really a religious guy. I'm a big fan of stories that deal with people who try to do the right thing. And that's kind of the message that I get out of these Madman stories is that Frank always tries to do the right thing. He doesn't always succeed. He has done horrible things in his past, and he's trying to at times make up for that. But in general, he's a very good-hearted person who wants to help people. And he just happens to be the reanimated corpse of a dead man, which apparently, again, from what I've read, ties into a lot of the Mormon faith. I guess. I don't know. I didn't do a lot of research, just read a couple things. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this book does not come off as like Allred trying to indoctrinate people into the Mormon faith. This is not a propaganda book that is trying to recruit people or anything like that. This is, I don't know. I feel like that has to be said because I know folks get a little suspicious when it comes to someone who is a person of faith who believes in a certain religion and is creating a work of literature in which they put in a lot of their beliefs. And, I'm one of those people. I get kind of mistrustful with that kind of stuff because I'm not a religious person. I believe in certain things. I'm not going to get into all that here. But I'm not a big fan of the practice of religion. And I'm not a big fan of anyone trying to pull me into something that I don't necessarily believe in. I don't do that to other folks. I'm not out there trying to convince people not to go to church. So I would appreciate it if people don't try to convince me to go to church, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which, frankly, I think is a Christian thing. I don't know. I don't know a lot about that stuff, but I felt like I should have to point that out, I guess, because once I started kind of a deeper dive into, just starting out as what the frick is a Nephite and what does that have to do with Madman in this book? And, I learned that, over time, as Allred was creating this book, that Frank ultimately became Mike Allred. He was using Frank to get a lot of stuff out of his head, worked through some things. And, when you are creating something, when you're writing something, a lot of times, most of the characters for some folks, I'm one of them, they put themselves or certain aspects of themselves into various characters. And so it makes sense that there would be a lot of Mormon dogma, I guess, in this book. But had I not gone out and just looked up what the flip a Nephite was, I honestly never would have known. I knew that Allred was a Mormon. Again, I feel like I'm almost saying that like, condemn that man. How dare he? And that's not what I'm doing here. That's not what I'm saying. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just trying to say that, this is not, if you've heard of the Madman comic and you've not read it because you've heard that Mike Allred is a Mormon and that there's a lot of Mormon dogma in the book, and so you're not going to read it because you don't want to read a book where some quote unquote religious fanatic tries to convert you to their crazy ways. That's not, I don't get that at all out of this book. Of course, I haven't finished it yet, so I guess we'll see, right? Anyway, the scene here where he is having this dream, it's just 2 panels where he meets the Nephite, the one of 3. He's already met the other 2. And again, this guy looks like Clint Eastwood. And of the 2 panels, the first panel, all we see of him is his boot. And so in the second panel, he's telling Frank, trust your dreams. Well, actually, he tells him first, I will be seeing you soon. And then says, trust your dreams. They will tell you all you need to know. Your purpose will be revealed soon enough. In the meantime, concentrate on the present. And Frank's reply is like in birthday present or like now present. And Clint's response to him is just pull your head out, son, which I found quite funny. But that's when Frank wakes up and he's laying amongst the rocks. Again, he's still very tiny. He has survived the crash and the cave-in, and he's kind of chalking it up to the fact that he's really small. Maybe there's something about the fact that he's really teeny tiny, the size of a toothbrush. And, at one point, he actually tries to radio in to Dr. Flem by using the CB communicator from the Moto Router car. And I'll be honest with you, folks, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. I can't remember if it's called a Moto Router car or not. All I can think of when I say that is Roto Rooter, which I think is a carpet shampooing company. But he tries to use this CB communicator. And if you've seen a CB mic, I guess you'd call it, from like the Smokey and the Bandit movies, he's about as tall as one of those. So yeah, he's not very big, and he can't seem to get the CB to work. It's busted. He comes across in the wreckage, the puke monster. Terrence was his name? I don't remember. He was a regular guy who was attacked by aliens, and they set him afire, and something about that changed his DNA and his skin into a human vomit, which is pretty gross. But the puke monster is still in the jar. He's about as small as Frank is now. And the thing actually says to him, "Help me." And Frank doesn't. He leaves him there. I'm sure he's going to come back for him, or at least that's his plan. But he needs to get back to Dr. Flem, and he needs to get back to Joe, and he needs to get himself big again. And of course, he doesn't want to just let the puke monster go because he's afraid that the puke monster will kill him, will try to absorb him like he did with all the doctors and whatnot in the hospital back in the previous issue, because it was hungry. And because of that, Frank is very well justified by not letting the puke monster out. And he sees a drainage pipe that is emptying out into the tunnel where the collapse has happened. And he decides to go into the pipe and see where that takes him. Once within the pipe, he eventually, as he travels on, comes to basically pitch black darkness. He can barely even see the hands in front of his face. Finally, he comes to some light, and it's a drain grate above him, and there is a rope hanging from it, which appears to be probably somebody's hair. And he climbs up out of the drainage grate thing, and it's a floor drain in a bathroom. And in his narration, which I say it every time, these are journal entries from the journaling that he does. He says, "I found myself in what looked to be some kind of public restroom. Maybe it was my size, but the familiar stink actually seemed to have a weight to it." And then he writes, "Black. Somebody has put some graffiti on the wall of the bathroom stall that says Robert Rodriguez is the cat's meow." Robert Rodriguez is the director, most currently notable for the Boba Fett TV show on Disney Plus. But Frank is making his way across the bathroom floor when he sees a spider, which is basically a giant monster to him. It chases him across the bathroom floor. It is about to get him when a foot from a normal-sized human being, but for Frank is a frickin' giant, steps on the spider just as the spider's about to get him, and the disturbance of the air pressure that happens with the foot coming down on the spider blows Frank into the air and into a fan that is sitting on a counter in the bathroom. He doesn't get chopped up or anything. He just kind of flies over to the fan, which blows him away. And he at one point says, "I'm a leaf in a tornado." And he reaches out to grab a hold of anything to stop himself from falling. And it appears to be some kind of spikes sticking out of a wall. But no, it's stubble from the giant person or the normal sized person that is in the bathroom with Frank. And they don't notice Frank. But what Frank quickly realizes is that the stubble that he's hanging off of is sticking out of a pimple. And this giant thing squeezes it. And Frank is ejected off of this person's face, with the pus that comes out of this pimple. I gotta say, puke monster in the previous issue and now getting bathed in pimple pus. I don't know what's wrong with Mr. Allred, but that's pretty gross. He is shot into the wall by this pus, and he is actually shot into the mirror because the creep is who this turns out to be, is looking into the mirror as he is popping his pimple. And I don't know the story behind the creep. Let me just tangent a minute when it comes to this character. We have seen him, I believe, at least twice in this book so far. He has been kind of a background character who literally just in one scene or the other, whenever he's made an appearance, he's just somebody walking by in the background, part of the scenery. And somebody that, again, he looks kind of zombie-ish. He's very gaunt and skeletal. He doesn't have a nose. The skin on his face is just freaking pulled back and tight so that his cheekbones stick out and his eyes are deeply inset into his face. And he's got really creepy fingernails. But the few times that we've seen him in this book, just walking around amongst the other citizens in Snap City, nobody seems to pay him any mind. So I don't know if he ever shows up again in this book, or if he was literally just created for this to ultimately end up in this issue to torment Frank while Frank is a tiny little person. But the pus from this guy's pimple shoots Frank into the mirror, and he is stuck to the mirror because of the pus. And his narration is saying, look deep into the darkest recesses of your mind and list the most horrible situations you can imagine. This one almost ranks in my top 10. He's able to pull himself out of the pus, and he falls from the mirror, lands on top of the faucet, bounces, and is about to fall from the faucet. He kind of catches himself clinging to the side of it like the side of a cliff, but he slips and he falls into the sink, and he's about to go down the drain, but somebody's hair is in the sink, and he's able to grab the hair and keep himself from falling into the sink. But then Creep suddenly starts saying, wash your hands, wash your hands. Always remember to wash your hands, especially when you sneezes, so you don't get no diseases. Squeaky clean, squeaky clean. And he turns the faucet on, which, of course, is not something Frank wants while he's hanging from a hair in the drain of the sink. The Creep doesn't seem to notice Frank yet at this point. But when the water comes out of the faucet and hits the bottom of the sink where Frank is, it actually, because Frank is so small, it hits him and launches him up out of the sink. Just like if a high pressure faucet, you turn it on and the water hits the bottom of the sink, drops are going to ricochet off out of the sink, right? Happens. And that's what happened to Frank, basically. He's with some of these drops of water. But as he's laying there on the floor with, this water, his body suddenly grows just a little bit. He starts to tingle and he grows just a little bit. And he realizes that really what he needs at this point is a good bath. He needs a good hose down. He needs to be hosed down. And he thinks that once that happens, he will get all of the chemicals off of him and he will grow back to normal size. Well, he looks around for wherever he can dunk himself into some water when the door creaks open and the little robot that we saw on the cover comes walking into the room. Now, these robots, let me see if it tells me how big this robot is on the website here of this actual toy. No, it doesn't seem to want to tell us that. But I would guess, based on how big this robot is compared to the Creep who picks it up at one point, this robot's probably about 1.5 to 2 feet tall. And Frank barely comes up to its knees. Well, this robot is, the moment this robot is introduced to this book, quickly becomes one of my favorite characters. And again, I don't know if this robot shows up in other issues. I don't know if we get to see him a lot moving forward, but the door creaks open. This robot kind of walks in and he goes, "Hey, yo, Frank, is yous in here?" "Hey, fella, is you's Frank?" He's talking to the creep. "I'm looking for Frank Einstein." And as this robot is talking, and the accent that Allred gives him makes me think of Ben Grimm, The Thing. And once that kind of hit my brain, from that moment forward, basically this robot who has a name, I don't remember what it is. We haven't got to that point in the issue yet, but the moment the robot starts talking and the moment I associate that with Ben Grimm, that's what I think of when I think of this robot now, that Ben Grimm, The Thing, his personality, his spirit, his soul was placed inside this tiny robot. Well, the creep sees the robot because the robot's talking to him. He says, "Is you Frank? I'm looking for Frank Einstein." And the creep leans down, and the robot tells him that his sensors are telling him that Frank Einstein's DNA is somewhere in, quote, "this sewer of a toilet. Is you him or what?" And Frank, who again doesn't even come up to the robot's knees, is yelling, "I'm Frank, I'm over here." But the creep picks up the robot, finding it funny and realizing a talking toy robot. He says, "You got to be worth something." And the robot says to him, "Hey, you're no Frank Einstein. I know Frank Einstein's DNA, and you're no Frank Einstein. Put me down right now, you big lug. I'm warning you." And then electricity shoots out of the robot, shocking, of course, the creep, who drops the robot onto the floor. Frank runs up to the robot, says, "That was wicked, pal. What's the skinny on you anyway?" And that's when the creep notices Frank, little tiny Frank down there, and says, "Little man, you did this, didn't you?" And tries to step on Frank, tries to stomp him like he did the spider earlier. And that's when the robot's chest thing, the front of his chest opens up, and a little dart flies out and hits the creep in the leg and knocks him unconscious. And this is also where we learn the robot's name. "That'll learn him. Don't ever mess with the mighty Myron. I'll kick your ass." So Frank asks, "Is he dead?" And Myron tells him, "Nah, I just put his lights out. I can't give no one the big whack unless I gets to say so." So we learn that Myron was sent by Dr. Flem to come find Frank. And he tells this story about being back in Buzztown. If you remember from a number of issues back, Dr. Flem's helping hands, these little globe spherical robots with arms and hands that he built to help him with his experiments, had built a robot named Astroman and took a brain scan that they had digitally of Frank and put it inside Astroman, making Astroman basically a robot version of Frank, even though he doesn't look like Frank. And then we learn that they built a couple other robots, and then these robots built robots, and those robots built robots, and suddenly they had just a crap ton of robots of all different sizes and colors and shapes down there in the lab. And they ran away at one point because they all freaked out when the humans showed up. And well, Myron tells this, Myron's one of these robots basically, but he tells this story of other robots. He calls them a swarm of renegade bots. They come into the lab through the rocket car tunnels, and they start, as he says, knocking heads. They knock out Mott the Hooble. They kidnap Joe and Dr. Flem and Gail and Bonnie, and they shoot other robots. They're destroying some of the other robots. They shoot a larger robot version of Myron, who Myron says is his mother. And you see there's a double page spread where this is happening, and they're carrying off Gail and Joe. And these robots look very similar to the ones that we saw in the 2 issues with Big Guy, the robots that came to kidnap Professor Boyford. And we also see amongst these robots is an RCA. Well, it says RCA visitor, but it's it's an old TV set with robot legs and robot arms and claw-like hands, pincer hands. And on the screen is Factor Max. this robot that we met back there during the big guy adventure, who we don't really know anything about at this point. But he's yelling out, "Where is the one called Frank Einstein? Tell me where he is or I'll destroy everything. I have no desire to destroy, but I will if I must." And then one of the robots in this double page spread is blowing up Myron's mother, and Myron's yelling out, "Mother!" And Dr. Flem is hiding behind some equipment, and he sees Myron and grabs him up, and he tinkers with him a moment so that he can detect Frank's DNA, and he hands him over to Marie, which is one of the helping hands robots, and sends him off down the tunnel to go look for Frank, because Frank's the only one that can help them at this point. Marie is shot and destroyed as they are escaping down the tunnel, but Myron is able to get out. So with that story finished, we're now outside of the bathroom. It's actually a bathroom at a filling station or a service station or a gas station, whatever neck of the woods you're in, whatever they call them. And Frank climbs up onto Myron, sitting on his head, and Myron heads off to the nearest rocket car tunnels, which what I was calling the Moto-Rooter car tunnels. So yeah, I guess I was getting that wrong. Rocket car tunnels. And he says the quickest way to get there is to cut through the boonies, which is a park or just some area of wilderness out there. And there's a moment where we get a line from Pulp Fiction. So Mike Allred's obviously a fan of Pulp Fiction, because as they're trudging along through the high grass and the woods, Frank is asking Myron, "Are we there yet? How much further?" And Myron says, "Yonder, so keep your shorts on." But then he stops. And Frank's like, "Well, what'd you stop for?" And he goes, "Shut up, something's coming." And Myron is whispering at this point. But Frank, who is, I guess, angry at this point, who can blame him? He just wants to get back to find out what happened to Joe. He's fought a puke monster. He got shrunken down to smaller than an action figure. He got popped with a zit, and he was almost stepped on by a giant person. And then he learns that Joe may be dead, or at least in trouble. And he's not interested in stopping. He wants to get there. So he kind of cracks back at Myron. "Don't tell me to shut up, pal. I may be small, but that doesn't keep me from loosening a few screws. Get me?" And then this is when we get our Pulp Fiction line. Myron whispers to him, "If I'm curt with you, it's because time is a factor. I think fast, I talk fast, and I need you to act fast if you want to get out of this. So pretty please, with sugar on it. Shut up and sit down." So Frank, who's saying, "Deja vu, that sounds familiar somehow." But while I have already in my mind basically associated Myron with the Thing, I almost feel like what Allred is saying here by using that line from Pulp Fiction, it's not just simply Allred inserting a line from maybe one of his favorite movies. I think it's his way of telling us that this voice that Myron is using, the voice that we should be hearing, is Harvey Keitel's voice, because that line is Mr. Wolf, the character that Harvey Keitel plays in Pulp Fiction. So it's not long before we see what Myron had sensed. I guess his robotic senses, his sensors had picked up on something coming. And it's a black fur-covered creature with big yellow eyes. And the issue description referred to this creature as the yellow-eyed creature from under the stairs. And, I just literally just within the last week sat down over like a 72-hour period and read through the entire first volume of the Madman library editions. We're talking 16 issues, I believe, of Madman. The first 3-issue series that was just called Madman, the second 3-issue series that was called Madman Adventures, and then the next 10 issues of Madman Comics from Dark Horse. And I don't remember if this creature showed up at all before this point, but Frank's not too worried about it because he can see a storm drain ahead of them. And he knows that just within that storm drain is that's where they need to go to get to the rocket car tunnels. And he wants to get a closer look. He tells Myron that he's tiny. The thing's not going to see him. And Myron reminds him, yeah, but you kind of stink, so it's going to smell you. And sure enough, it does, and goes straight for Frank, who dives into the storm drain. And the thing reaches in for him, pulls the grate off of the storm drain, and reaches down there and grabs Frank. All the while, Frank is like, Strange, I don't sense any hostility from you toward the creature. Maybe we can make like friends. The thing reaches into the storm drain and pulls him out. And Myron comes running up. That does it. Back off or taste dirt, Yeti. And he fires one of his darts at the creature, but Frank is calling out, it's okay, Myron. I don't think it's hostile. Myron says, it don't matter. We gots to get going. And he fires the dart at the creature, and it just kind of knocks it aside and runs off with Frank. And Frank's yelling back at Myron, really, Myron, don't sweat it. Something feels right. But Myron is responsible for Frank. He has this task that was programmed into him. He was to find Frank and bring him back. So he goes chasing after this creature. Well, the creature takes Frank and climbs up the side of a mountain, and at the top drops him off and runs away. And Frank turns around, and there is the third Nephite that he saw in his dream. Frank quickly, between panels, tells him that, well, what happened to him, why he's so small, and is telling him that he thinks that if he can just wash it all off, he'll go back to normal size. And then starts asking the third Nephite why they all think he's important. Who are the three of them, the three Nephites we've now met? And they have, as Frank says, you led me to believe I've got some special destiny, but you always leave me with unanswered questions. And the third Nephite tells him, it's always best to keep things simple, don't you think? Why confuse you with something now that will be abundantly clear later? You'll find that when taking the proper steps, you get to the top a lot faster. And then he carries him over to a well, sticks him in the bucket, drops the bucket down in the well. That's when Myron shows up and tells the Nephite to put his hands up. Says, I don't know what your game is, stranger. What are you? Why can't I register your DNA? But the Nephite was helping Frank this entire time, because then he pulls the bucket back up and Frank is riding the bucket, but he is now normal size. And Frank tells Myron that everything's okay now. They can go to Buzztown. And he tells the Nephite, I guess this was some screwy introduction. You're not going to tell me anything else, are you? And the guy says, the time is the time when it's the time. And when it's time, the four horsemen will ride. Good luck, kid. And Frank and Myron head off. Myron, however, feels that there's something spooky about that guy. Frank has to agree and says that I can't shake the feeling that my whole life is some cosmic summer rerun, like I've never gotten off the island, where my 5-year mission will never end. But then he says, even so, it all feels so right. So they get down into the rocket car tunnels. They make their way back to Dr. Flem's lab. When they get there, the place is a shambles. It's a wreck. Screens are broken. There are pieces of robots lying on the floor. Frank sees Mechanical Man and Mr. Robot, who we've met in a previous issue, but they're all smashed up. And he's asking Myron, what did these robots look like? Why would they want me? And Myron tells him that I told you they're flying robots, and then says, oh, I forgot to tell you, I heard him call the head robot Factor Max. And Frank recognizes the name, of course, but he still doesn't understand what that has to do with him. In the meantime, he goes around the lab and he collects a bunch of weapons. He's got a rifle, a baseball bat, and 4 pistols in holsters strapped around his body. And he tells Myron, you sure you can sniff him out, Myron? Because, no offense, I'm going to waste some robots. And Myron tells him that there's no offense taken. I'm with you all the way, pal. They offed my mudder. When you wants to play, you gots to pay. And then he tells Frank that he's already locked onto their signal, and then yells out, behind you, watch it. And a little chamber thing opens up, and inside is Astro Man, who, when last we saw Astro Man, he had been blasted apart by the dude on the Wee Isles, that the demon that Mr. Mondstadt had been working for. The demon had sent this, he was a terrorist, Mick or Mickey, who thought the demon was God, and he thought he was trying to atone for his sins because he had placed a bomb inside of a building and found out just before it exploded that the building was actually an orphanage, but not just an orphanage. It was an orphanage for blind children. And so that's not something he wanted to do. And so he wanted to atone for his sins. That's when the demon came along. The guy thought the demon was God, and the demon told him that if he wants to make up for his sins, he had to go kill Frank. But he kills Astro Man instead, who has put Frank's costume on, knowing that the guy would think that he killed Frank and that Astro Man, being a robot, would be able to be brought back to life. And sure enough, here he is. Flem had recovered Astro Man's head from the scene and had taken him back to the lab and still had that brain scan from Frank. And so we get Astro Man right at the very end. That's how it ends. The chamber door opens. There's a lot of purple smoke. Astro Man is standing there. Frank says, Astro Man. And we get next, Runaway Renegade Robots, or Factor Max Rising. So yeah, another freaking great issue and another new character that I have just immediately fallen in love with, which is Myron. We got near the beginning, I think by issue 2 or 3 of the first series, we get introduced to Jo, fall in love with her. We get introduced to Mott in the first couple issues of the Dark Horse run that we're into right now, Madman Comics, and I fall in love with him. And now Myron. And I really do hope we see more of Myron. Having finished volume 1 here of the Madman Library Edition, all that means at this point is that I've read the next issue number 10. I haven't gone any further than that, but I was kind of peeking through the second volume, and we are quickly coming upon issues that I have not read. But here's the thing. Let me just kind of lay out the schedule for you for the next few weeks, because if you're reading these through the library editions like I am, some of the stuff in there is a little bit out of order. And I don't mean the actual issues of the Madman books, but in volume 2, we're not only going to be getting more from Madman Comics, and in fact, I think we get the rest of the Dark Horse run in volume 2, but we also get some of the, I guess, crossover books that Madman had done during this time. There was he crossed over with Nexus in a Nexus book called Nexus Meets Madman #1. He crossed over with Superman, 3 issues called the Superman Madman Hullabaloo. And he crossed over with a character named The Jam. Now, along with this, and honestly, I can't remember where all this falls into place, because I also have volume 3. And I know that in volume 3, we also get the 7 issues of Red Rocket 7, which technically is not a Madman book, but I'm going to go ahead and include them here as part of this Madman read-through that I'm going to do, only because they are included in the Madman library. And the same with the Atomics. Eventually, we're going to come to a series called the Atomics that is set in the Madman universe. I will be reading those and talking about those as well. And actually, there are 3 issues of a superhero book. It's like the first superhero book Mike Allred did. And I believe he worked on it with his brother, and it's called They or Them. I honestly don't remember. I didn't read those. That's the last 3 issues that is in volume 1. And I do eventually want to read those, and we will eventually talk about them, because again, if I'm going to read and talk about Red Rocket 7 and the Atomics simply because they're in the collection, then I should read and talk about those. But let me just kind of fill you in on the schedule at this point, because as I said, I am going to do a number of Madman issues in a row before I kind of take a break from Madman and then move on to G.I. Joe or ElfQuest or Conan or something like that. But we just did Madman issue number 9, Madman Comics issue number 9. Last week, of course, we did issue 8. So next week, we will do part 16, which is Madman Comics issue number 10. That will come out on February 1st. And then after that, we'll do Madman part 17, and we'll look at Nexus Meets Madman issue number 1. It was just a 1-issue, one-shot special. And like I said, that issue, as it's presented in the library editions, is not placed in order of publication, but I'm going to read them and talk about them in the order that they were published. So after Madman Comics number 10, instead of going on to issue 11, we're going to read Nexus Meets Madman number 1, because that issue came out in May of 96. Issue 10 came out in February of 96. And then issue 11 came out in October of 96. So we'll have next week, part 16, Madman Comics, issue number 10. And I think I said February 1st, but actually that'll come out on February 7th. Part 17 will be Nexus Meets Madman. That'll come out on February 14th. And then part 18 will be Madman Comics, issue number 11. And that'll come out on February 21st. And then the next 3 weeks, February 28th, March 7th, and March 14th, we're going to look at the 3 issues of the Superman Madman Hullabaloo, where Madman teams up with Superman, and that's all written and drawn by Allred. And then at that point, we're going to take a break, because following that, as far as order of publication, is the 7-issue Red Rocket miniseries. And so I want to take a break, and then when we come back to Madman, we'll start with Red Rocket 7. All right, sound good? But yeah, this is an issue that I did read when going back to issue number 9. This is an issue I read back when it was coming out, when it hit the shelves back in October of 95. And the only thing that really stuck out to me, as far as the one thing that I could remember the most reading it the first time, was Myron. I obviously had fallen in love with that character all the way back then and still love him today. And even though I did read issue number 10 just within the last couple of days, I don't remember how much Myron is in issue number 10. And following issue number 10, I know that I have issues 11 and 12, 13, 14, and 15, because I think issues 12, 13, 14, and 15 are a 4-issue story arc dealing with Professor Boyford. And as I was kind of skimming through the next couple of volumes, I was looking at the covers, and I recognized those going up to issue. Matter of fact, I recognized the covers for the rest of the Dark Horse series, which goes to issue number 20. But I don't know that I've actually read them, which is kind of insane, because if I recognize the covers, I feel like I own the issues. So why didn't I read them? Maybe I don't own the issues. Maybe I've just seen them online and at one point was trying to hunt them down, but I don't remember anything about them. I just know that there's the 4-issue Professor Boyford story coming up. And I think there's something called the G-Men from Hell that deal with Mike Mattress and his partner that Joe works for. But I don't remember really what those issues are about, but I feel like I own them. So maybe I have read them. It's just, I don't remember anything about them. And as I start reading them again, maybe, some memories will bloom in my head. But once again, back to issue number 9, really quite enjoyed this. I enjoyed the challenges that Frank had to overcome as a tiny little action figure sized person. I think that whole sequence in the bathroom was done very well. You really kind of felt what it was like to be a little tiny action figure sized person. I think Allred did a really good job with perspective and whatnot. He didn't just draw it from the point of view of someone who is normal size. It was all drawn for a lot of it from Frank's point of view. So, for example, when he's hanging off of the creep's facial stubble, you don't really realize what that is at first. It does look like possibly broken rebar coming out of, granted, a flesh-colored wall, but your mind doesn't immediately go to, oh, that's stubble. Because each piece, each bit of hair would have been like the size of rebar, if not a bit thicker compared to Frank. And the part with the yellow-eyed creature from beneath the stairs, that just has me. I really honestly don't think we've encountered this creature before, but I find it interesting when Allred kind of brings elements like that into these stories, because I don't know if this is something that the yellow-eyed creature from beneath the stairs, which is again what the description of the issue calls it. I don't know if we're going to see that thing again. I don't know if it's a bigger part or has a bigger part to play. I don't know if it's just something that just its sole purpose in this book was to snatch up Frank and take him up to the Clint Eastwood Nephite guy. I don't know, but I just find that kind of stuff really interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing much more of it. But you can look forward to more Madman episodes all throughout February and through the first half of March, beginning, well, actually, that began last week, but continuing next week with issue number 10, which is called Runaway Renegade Robots. So until then, folks, my name is Steven, and I'm just another fanboy. Be nice to each other. The Just Another Fanboy podcast is a Stephen or Else production. Questions and comments can be directed to justanotherfanboy@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram by searching for @StephenOrElse, and then come join in on all the fun at the Just Another Fanboy message boards at forum.justanotherfanboy.com. You can support the show for as little as $1 a month over at the Patreon by going to patreon.com/StephenROr, and in return, I am going to do my very best to get you and your fellow patrons episodes just like this one before anybody else. I also encourage you to rate the show wherever available and share this episode with a friend. All links will be in the show notes.
Bye-bye, Daddy.
Bye-bye, Daddy.
Good job.
Uh-oh.
All right, here we go. It's minuscule. It's mired in minutia. It's a microcosm of madcap malignity. Malignity? Better look that up. Malignity. I said it right. Let's try that again then.